Thank you for taking the time out of your evening to attend the second presentation in our Antisemitism Studies lecture series featuring Dr. Amy Elman, whose talk is titled October 7th, Sexual Violence, Denial, and Defamation. Special thanks to our co-sponsors for this event, the Weitzman Museum of American Jewish History. Additionally, we are immensely grateful for the generous support of the Isidore and Penny Myers Foundation in helping Gratz to launch our pioneering MA in Antisemitism Studies. My name is Eyal Feinberg, and I'm an Associate Professor of Political Science and Antisemitism Studies here at Gratz. I serve as the Director of the Center for Holocaust Studies and Human Rights, where I have the unique privilege of overseeing 4 academic programs, including the world's largest Holocaust and Genocide Studies graduate program. Today, and through this lecture, I want to call attention to some very exciting news. Gratz College is launching America's first Masters of Arts degree program in Antisemitism Studies. Although we are officially fielding our first cohort for fall of 2024, thanks to tremendous interest in the program, as well as our faculty expertise, we are able to offer anti-Semitism-specific courses for those who cannot wait and would like to enroll for summer. In fact, we've already accepted a handful of students into the MA in Anti-Semitism Studies program, as well as our graduate certificate. They are educators, social workers, lawyers, professors, entrepreneurs, community leaders, and rabbis. I'm proud to share that the quality of our newest cohort of students is simply astounding. It's an important strength of our growing anti-Semitism program. Let me be clear. There is nowhere else in the country that one can develop a deep knowledge and functional expertise in combating anti-Semitism through an expert-curated interdisciplinary curriculum being taught by the world's leading scholars and practitioners, all with a supportive community of accomplished and diverse students. Being an instructor of these students and a part of this program is one of the great honors of my life. I want to encourage everyone, especially post 10/7, who wants to make an impact, who is eager. Consider this amazing opportunity to become an anti-Semitism studies expert at Gratz. The world desperately needs more people that can help actively secure a prosperous Jewish future. This is the time for our community and for society more broadly to invest in this education. We must, and now we can, be empowered to be the change agents we need in this moment. I'm going to briefly share the outline of today's festivities. First, I have the pleasure of introducing Arthur Sandman, the Chief Operating Officer for the Weitzman National Museum of American Jewish History. He will share remarks about Weitzman's mission and Gratz's growing partnerships with Weitzman. Following these remarks, Dr. Amy Elman will present her lecture on 10/7 sexual violence, denial, and defamation. This lecture will be immediately followed by a Q&A. Please feel free to submit questions both during and following the presentation. I will monitor and I will share your questions with Dr. Elman. After the Q&A, I will briefly provide remarks about the motivation, need, and structure of our new MA program in Anti-Semitism Studies. I will then introduce 2 of our amazing Gratz graduate students, Olivia Lane and Michael Denning. We will host an open discussion about what it's like to be a student at Gratz, how Gratz has impacted their career, and answer any questions from the audience about the new MA program. If you know anybody interested in the program, I strongly suggest sticking around for this panel. It is now with great enthusiasm that I turn the floor over to Arthur Sandman.
On behalf of the Weitzman National Museum of American Jewish History, on historic Independence Mall in Philadelphia, I add my welcome to you for attending. Our mission at the Weitzman is to present educational programs and experiences that preserve, explore, and celebrate The History of Jews in America. Our purpose is to connect Jews more closely to their heritage and to inspire in people of all backgrounds a greater appreciation for the diversity of the American Jewish experience and the freedoms to which Americans aspire. We are proud of our public programs like this one, both online and in person. Our educational programs, working with students of all ages across the country, and exhibitions, including our core, which walks visitors through the over 350-year history of Jews in America, and a current special exhibition, as you see behind me, of paintings by local artists of the hostages taken on October 7th. We are pleased to be part of tonight's program in collaboration with Gratz College. Beyond this series, we are also together launching a Gratz Weitzman Anti-Semitism Pedagogy Advisory Committee Fellowship. This partnership will offer Gratz graduate students who are also middle and high school teachers the opportunity to pilot and co-author pieces of the Weitzman Museum's groundbreaking national initiative, Stories That Shaped a Nation, Jewish Lives in America, a curriculum designed to counter anti-Semitism in schools by teaching about the complex, joyful, and true histories of the Jewish people, the place of Israel within that history, and the diversity within the Jewish people. Fellowship finalists will be announced on March 15th, and the program will launch in April. Stay in touch and up to date with everything happening at the Weitzman by visiting our website, www.theweitzman.org, and following us on social media at Weitzman Museum. Now I'll hand it back to the director of the Center for Holocaust Studies and Human Rights at Gratz College, tonight's host, Dr. Eyal Feinberg.
Thank you for sharing important details about how Gratz and Weitzman are working together to reduce anti-Semitism. It's now with great pleasure that I introduce our speaker for tonight, Dr. Amy Elman. Dr. Elman is professor of political science and the William Weber Chair of Social Science at Kalamazoo College in Michigan. She graduated from Brandeis University with a BA and went on to receive an MA and PhD in comparative politics at New York University. She's received numerous awards for her scholarship, including 2 Fulbright grants, a fellowship from the National Endowment for the Humanities, and a grant from the Sassoon International Center for the Study of Anti-Semitism at Hebrew University. She has worked on behalf of women's rights and against anti-Semitism domestically and within Europe for over 3 decades. She has lectured and published widely on the response of states and the European Union to issues of citizenship, migration, violence against women, sex discrimination, and anti-Semitism. She has published 4 books. Her most recent book, entitled The European Union, Anti-Semitism and the Politics of Denial, University of Nebraska Press, explores the conditions that precipitated the EU's efforts to stem anti-Semitism and considers the consequences. I also want to give a less formal introduction to Dr. Elman, so Amy, if I can. Amy is unbelievably generous with her time and resources, and is an unparalleled mentor for junior scholars engaging in anti-Semitism research and advocacy. I recently saw Amy present at a conference in Phoenix and was completely blown away by her ability to professionally capture the subject of 10/7 denialism. It remains the only academic lecture that ever gave me goosebumps. So without further ado, I turn the floor over to the great Dr. Amy Elman. Thank you, Amy.
Wow. Thank you for your incredibly generous introduction. And I can't tell you what a pleasure it is for me to be with you all here this evening on a shared platform between Gratz College and one sponsored by the Weitzman National Museum of Jewish History. In fact, the museum's Jewish Priorities program offers access to unparalleled public intellectuals since 10/7. And I want to tell you that some of those lectures inform my own. I'm profoundly touched to provide an inaugural address to launch the country's first master interdisciplinary program dedicated to anti-Semitism. With its internationally recognized graduate program in Holocaust and gender studies, Gratz College, I think, is uniquely placed to deliver on its promise of preparing graduate students with, in their words, the functional skill set required to combat Jew hatred and root out prejudice more broadly. I want to continue my introduction because it concerns Professor Eyal Feinberg. I want to say that under his dynamic leadership, the leadership of someone like Professor Feinberg, who's a prolific scholar in his own right, whose research is often employed by policymakers. So I think it's pretty clear to many of us that Gratz's program will bridge the gap between theory and practice, policy and implementation. And in looking at your talented roster of broadly trained faculty, it's pretty clear that one notes that is something that my friend Lisa Brush would have argued, which is that you've got a program that has a historian's eye for context, a social scientist's passion for evidence and explanation, and not least a policy analyst's hunger for relevance. And so I hope that my lecture this evening really meets these same standards when I'm about to speak to you about October 7th, sexual violence, denial, and defamation. So this audience, I think, will no doubt note that it's become rather fashionable for anti-Israel protesters to deny Hamas's October 7th attack against Israeli civilians and the sexual assaults that accompanied it. And I think their revisionism exploits the unspeakable character of the atrocities of that day to further inflict harm by negating the victim's experiences and denying that victims even exist. So let's move to the second slide, please, so that we know that I'll be focusing this evening on 3 threads connected to this trend in order to operationalize what you see as the operationalization of silence now on college and university campuses throughout the United States. So the first thread is on the passion of anti-Zionists, and the second one is the pornography of the perpetrators, and not least the feminist impersonators who give cover to atrocity denial. So again, those 3 threads will mark this evening's lecture. First, let me begin, though, with the passionate anti-Zionists on the next slide, please. And what you'll see is that faced with the largest massacre of Jews in a single day since the Holocaust, there was this Penn student who rejoiced at, in her own words, and I quote, "the joyful and powerful images which came from the glorious October 7th." And she stated, "I remember feeling so empowered and happy, so confident that victory was near and so tangible. I want all of you to hold that feeling in your hearts, never let go of it." And then she implored her audience to bring it to the streets. And so they have across college campuses and university campuses throughout this country. Recall as well the Cornell University Associate Professor of History, who declared that October 7th was energizing and exhilarating, and the professor of modern politics and intellectual history at Columbia, who insisted that the, quote, resistance offensive was awesome. Not to be outdone, you'll see a woman to your right. This is George Washington University assistant professor of psychology, who managed to distinguish herself by going on the offensive and condemning those who, in her words, slander the name of our martyrs as terrorists. She states this before leaving for Qatar. And thus, one of the things that we see is the continued reluctance to actually name the violence and instead defend and celebrate those who perpetrate it. Indeed, a student from my own campus was contemptuous of the quote, white bitches, end of quote, so pardon me, who had the audacity to express their horror at Hamas's slaughter. And now women are expected to remain silent about sexual atrocities, I would say particularly when men execute them under the auspices of liberation. Those speaking out against the sexual violence of so-called freedom fighters are now derided as colonial feminists and as racist. So let me be clear, and I'm sure many of you already know this, but it needs to be underscored, unfortunately, again, that Hamas and its supporters raped women and girls, cut off their breasts and tossed them about. They removed the fetus of a living pregnant woman whom they had bound and gagged like so many others. They shot bullets into the vaginas and heads of their victims, decapitated countless others, and mutilated men's genitals. Captured terrorists acknowledged that the sexual violence that was enacted was not incidental. Enacted as a weapon of war, sexual abuse was systematically perpetrated in each zone of the massacre, and even the United Nations recognized that. A dead terrorist's notebook that was found contained a translation key, and in it in Hebrew, it read, "Take off your pants." 4 words that underscore the premeditated nature of what went into this. And those 4 words, I think, help account for the piles of bloodied corpses naked below the waist. That this sadism is characterized continuously as, quote, resistance, testifies to the depth of anti-Semitism and the normalization of sexual abuse that accompanies it. It is this aspect of October 7th that I really want to underscore in my talk. Terrorists called home from the killing fields giddy. One, a United Nations affiliated school teacher, laughingly referred to a woman he captured as a sex slave, and his comrade responded by referring to a woman that he had captured as a horse, or in his words, a noble mare. There is now the infamous terrorist who boasted, "Your son killed so many Jews. Mom, your son's a hero." But less covered was the jubilant response of his mother, who exclaimed, and I quote, "I wish I was there with you." Some women were there. Gazan women and children as young as 10 followed the so-called heroes into Israeli homes where they looted and aided the terrorists for hours. Having covered the elation of Hamas's supporters, I'd like to turn to the second component of my talk, which is the graphic, sexually explicit documentation of subordination and the terror that I just described moments ago, because that is what pornography is. It's the sexually explicit documentation of abuse. So, on to pornography. You need to know, and I think many of us already do, that the terrorists filmed themselves with body cameras and cell phones, and then they posted clips of their exploits to their own families, so they're not ashamed. And they also sent them to the friends and families of their victims to taunt them. Sometimes they also forced the loved ones of their victims to witness the rapes in public view. Their behavior is reminiscent of Serbia's fascists, who, according to Natalie Nenadic, used rape and the pornography they made of it, in her words, as a public spectacle to induce women to leave their homes and never return. Nearly 200,000 Israelis have since been evacuated from their homes. That gets so little coverage in the mainstream press. And the fact remains that many of them are unlikely to return to their homes. That one set of perpetrators raped for Serbia and another to quote, free Palestine, doesn't mean that the rapes were then or are now the perpetrator's only tool, or that women and girls are their only victims. Hamas forced Israeli hostages, including a young boy of just 12 years old, to repeatedly watch the pornography that they produced on October 7th. Held alone for 6 weeks, Hamas told him that his kibbutz and Israel no longer existed. And for those still in captivity, the sexual abuse likely continues. Now, in the 1990s, feminists, and myself among them, warned that the rape death camps that were so central to Serbia's so-called ethnic cleansing offered a pornographic script that others would follow. Nenadic wrote, "We can be sure that all present and future fascists and misogynists of the world are watching and taking note about how to do it and how to get away with it." The fact that it took over a year of lobbying by Indigenous women's groups and survivors before the media, human rights groups, and women's organizations even bothered to respond to the barbarity of Serbia's fascists is incredibly heartbreaking. And to know that women's groups were among the last then to acknowledge the horror demonstrates, I think, rather clearly how unresponsive the women's movement had already become to those seeking to counter not just the sexual exploitation of women, but their annihilation. And so it continues. The fact that pornography is seldom regarded as harm testifies to the success that men and the women who ally with them have had in concealing sexual abuse by photographing it. And that's a hard one for folks to understand. What I'm saying is that through pornography, we have a situation in which sexual abuse is decontextualized as assaultive and reconstituted as art, speech, my students would say sex work, and now it's reconstituted as resistance. Predictably, Hamas's supporters include not only the feminist impersonators with a rather long history of supporting pornography as so-called sex positive, but pornographers themselves. One Hamas supporter, a pornographer named Khalifa, tweeted the following: "Can someone please tell the freedom fighters in Palestine to flip their phones and film horizontal?" While survivors of October 7th testified to the pleasure that Palestinians took in the crimes they committed, no less important is the thrill that they and their accomplices derive in downplaying or outright denying that the atrocities took place, and their feigned incredulity is absolutely pernicious. Like Holocaust deniers, they dispute the forensic evidence and the direct testimonies of Jews as malicious lies. And because the Holocaust and October 7th are emblematic of evil, deniers have been able to revitalize anti-Semitism, which is what we're seeing now. They've been able to revitalize anti-Semitism by convincing others that the crimes for which Jew hating can be blamed never happened. So what I'm describing is the operationalization of silence, such that tearing down hostage posters under the pretext that they are somehow Islamophobic propaganda becomes an almost moral act. And it is also notable that according to a YouGov Economist poll that was just conducted in December of this past year, 20% of Americans under 30 stated that the Holocaust is a myth. So we have our work cut out for us. With this in mind, just with that piece of data in mind, let's turn now to the campuses where many may be implicated in that finding. And so the third segment of the talk has to do with these feminist impersonators. The protean character of anti-Semitism and its denial is also evidenced through this ostensibly feminist cast of characters who subscribe to it. Such feminist impersonators include an adjunct professor of gender and women's studies at Berkeley, seen top right, who attended a November Oakland City Council meeting to promote a one-sided immediate ceasefire resolution that condemns Israel's response to Hamas. There she stated, as you see, the notion that October 7th was a massacre of Jews is a fabricated narrative. And indeed, she declares that many of those killed on October 7th, including children, were killed by the IDF. A professor of gender and women's studies, bottom right, to the right, professor of gender, women, and sexuality studies at the University of Minnesota, made headlines weeks later when, as an applicant for a senior administrative diversity, equity, and inclusion position at the university, they denied the sexual violence of October 7th. Speaking as a rape crisis counselor who believes survivors, which is fascinating, right? Because what it suggests is, I have the authority as a rape crisis counselor, and if I don't believe a survivor, that means that they aren't one. So again, speaking as a rape crisis counselor who believes the survivors, and then the professor compared Israeli rape survivors to white women whose fabrications of rape against Black men in the segregated South led to lynching. So this particular position of rape denialism parrots a broadcast from the electronic Intifada weeks prior, stressing the absence of, in their words, firsthand testimony. The electronic Intifada ended up downplaying why it is that victims were no longer alive to provide that firsthand testimony. Its only woman commentator, a white woman, likened the terrorists to Emmett Till, a 14-year-old Black boy falsely accused of offending a white woman in a Mississippi grocery store in 1955. This increasingly common deflection, known as DARVO, DARVO refers to deny, attack, reverse victim, and offender. Again, DARVO, deny, attack, and reverse victim and offender. This DARVO entails sexual abuse perpetrators consistently attacking the veracity of their victims so that they can assume the victim role. And in this instance, the DARVO that was done by by the electronic Intifada's reversal involves not just a reversal of rape and victim, but race baiting that depicts Jews as white nationalists and then declares the terrorists as victims of false allegations in ways that I would tell you the proponents of false memory syndrome and the far right could have never imagined. So casting themselves as truth seekers, deniers exploit the reluctance of very traumatized survivors to come forward, and they also discredit those reporting on the abuse. So another example would be the Gray Zone's relentless campaign to disgrace the New York Times and The Guardian for their coverage of Hamas's violence, insisting that these and other reporters issued, in their words, fabrications curated by Israel, and another quote, to present a story in order to justify genocide in Gaza. Its editor omits Hamas's calls for Israel's eradication and Hamas's own insistence that it is interested in repeating October 7th again and again. So with rhetoric redolent of Holocaust deniers, this editor insists instead that no systematic sexual atrocities occurred on October 7th, and that reporters engaged in, and I quote, the biggest media scandal of our time. For those of you who do Holocaust denial, you know that this sounds like the greatest hoax of the 20th century. It's the same rhetoric. Silencing survivors and their communities under the guise of fact-finding and feminist and anti-racism is an especially effective means of gaslighting that ensures further anguish and rape's normalization. And such normalization, sadly, will likely restore the very corroboration requirements and marital rape exemptions that feminists ended decades ago. That's the reactionary period we're in. Only last month at Queens College in New York, the Muslim student group hosted the editor of The Muslim Skeptic, whose Islamist writings include statements like, and I quote, "There's no rape if the husband or wife touches a spouse sexually, as this is their right by virtue of marriage, regardless of consent." And then, in defending sexual slavery, he similarly explained, though without the whiff of gender neutrality, there is no rape if a master sexually touches his female slave, as the master has a right to do this by virtue of ownership. Now, the reason that I'm sharing these quotes with you is that now I'd like us to recall the terrorists boasting about captured women through this lens that I just shared with you, because I think it enables us to better grasp Hamas's rape denialism and the absolution that its supporters extend to them. After all, it is impossible to rape a sex slave because sexual abuse and use is what women in captivity are for. The gender theorist to our left, Judith Butler, endorsed Hezbollah and Hamas in 2006 as part of the progressive social movement of the left, lends cachet to these terrorists and also to their allies. And despite Butler's recent claim within the last week or so that there's no alibi for Hamas's violence on October 7th, the Berkeley professor nonetheless depicts the terror as resistance, unapologetically so, and ignores entirely the central aspect of sexual violence that runs throughout the attacks. And such failure to provide a full-throated condemnation of Hamas is very much in keeping with Butler's hip quietism and that of Butler's idol, who was Michel Foucault. Foucault refused to criticize the Ayatollah's regime and acknowledged the nearly 50,000 Iranian women who marched on Tehran in 1979 for International Women's Day in defiance of Khomeini's dictatorship and the order that women veil themselves or be beaten. Far from recognizing that regime's brutality and its misogyny, Foucault suggested that feminist warnings at the time were antiquated attacks on Islam. And now consider the Iranian-backed, internationally recognized terror organization that is Hamas, and note his stance has since been repurposed as, quote, progressive and, quote, anti-racist. It is an article of faith, particularly by feminist imposters like Butler and others, as a means to exempt Hamas from similar scrutiny for its barbarity now. The assumption that atrocity deniers are somehow ill-informed or educable, I think, can be rather naive. It's consistent with the very redemptive narrative that views higher education as some sort of panacea for unethical values and its graduates as purveyors of truth. And that mode of thinking was very much countered by the German universities in the Third Reich. And it was, as Neil Ferguson reminds us, it was a university degree that, far from inoculating Germans against Nazism, made them more likely to embrace it. I'd like you to know that the professors that I've mentioned are far from marginal. In addition to Butler, there was that former George Washington University professor who I showed in an earlier slide, who insisted that we not slander Hamas. I want you to know that she served as president of the American Psychological Association's section for psychoanalysis and psychology before leaving for Qatar. The University of Minnesota professor here at the bottom right held postdoctoral positions at the University of Pennsylvania's Wolf Humanities Center and the Women and Gender Studies program at the University of Houston. This professor completed a PhD at Stanford and taught at Wellesley College long before arriving at Minnesota. The woman on your far left in the upper top hand portion of the screen came out with a book years ago that made the argument that essentially Israel traffics in human organs. And Jasper Puar, the professor that's pictured there, is a real proponent of Simcha Shissari's work at the University of Minnesota. The influence that these deniers have amassed over the years extends well beyond the classroom as their former students enter government, non-governmental organizations, the media, legal professions, and social movements. Consider the 2017 Women's March, at which organizers explicitly demanded the expulsion of Zionists, a demand that hardly dampened the enthusiasm of the media, which fawned all over them. Even prior, in 2015, the New York Times had already dubbed one of its principal organizers, Linda Sarsour, the Brooklyn homegirl in a hijab. And following the march, Time magazine listed the 4 organizers among their 100 most influential people for that year of 2017. Not one to arrive too late at a party, the Ms. Foundation also feted the Fab Four, whose message of inequity and Jewish exclusion was so unambiguous to those who cared to know about it that soon after, we see that Jews unwilling to renounce Israel, which is over 80% of us, unwilling to renounce Israel, were banished from student organizations throughout the country. And as some of you may know, the AJC just recently reported that 44% of current or recent college students have been deeply affected by campus anti-Semitism. So now the next slide, which I'm reaching towards our conclusion. In conclusion, countering the messaging of Hamas's infatuated supporters who claim to be both feminist and anti-racist requires exposing their sinister politics as anti-Semitic and dangerously disingenuous. In 1993, you'll see the quote to the left, Deborah Lipstadt, distressed by the failure of US campuses to recognize the dangers of Holocaust denial, warned us, correctly cast and properly camouflaged, Holocaust denial has a good chance of finding a foothold among coming generations. And as prescient as she was, it's unlikely, I think, that she could have anticipated the role that pornography and feminist impersonators would play in fostering that foothold. The last slide. I want to say that because hatred is never as frightening as when it masquerades as social justice, these are terrifying times, and I am deeply grateful that Gratz College will implement an innovative and rigorous academic program that we so desperately need. And I thank them and the illustrious Weitzman National Museum of American Jewish History for inviting me to speak with you all this evening in the hopes that we may effectively fight against this scourge.
I just want to thank you for this incredible, powerful, absolutely critical talk that you provided tonight. Thank you. There's not much else to say. This is such an important topic, and it's really our honor to be able to provide the platform for this subject at this time. Let's open the floor up for Q&A. So for those individuals, I see a few with their hands up in the Zoomosphere. Please, instead of raising your hand, please enter your question into the Q&A function, and I will do my best to organize and share those questions. Let me start off with one of my own, and then we'll move into the audience. So I think one of the more surprising elements that comes out of your talk is recognizing that anti-Semites get literal pleasure from engaging in anti-Semitism. I'd go as far as to say that this is something that's often missing in our theoretical structures, those that are trying to really understand and model anti-Semitism and who anti-Semites are. Is this pleasure something that is unique to anti-Semitism? And how should recognizing this, which so many of us do not, how should it alter our responses to anti-Semitism and anti-Semites?
Well, first of all, it is Nazism is a major trope for example, sadomasochists, and people talk about how sexy it all is. But one of the things that we have to understand is it's not unique to that kind of sadism. It's truly not. The fact that you have slave stocks used, the fact that we're talking about master and slave, the fact that we could even use that kind of language, and in any other context, it would be not okay. But in the context of sexuality, it's somehow embraced as a problem. So it's certainly not a situation in which Jews alone have our oppression eroticized. Absolutely not.
Thanks, Amy. One of our guests asked what can be done to counter the denialism, especially among progressive feminists. And I want to add a layer to that. And I want to say, especially amongst those that are seemingly more susceptible to the message. So thinking of those that are in Gen Z and also even millennials.
I think it's being as frank as possible. So given what I just said, right? If we take seriously that there are people who are equating murderers and terrorists with a Black young boy in the South who is murdered by racists, I can't tell you that when you pick that apart, one would have to come to the conclusion that these folks are at least somewhat consistent in their pimping of oppression. And I think that it needs to be unpacked that clearly. It really needs to be unpacked that clearly so that we're saying they're consistent in the ways that they have participated in a hijacking of our oppression, both to fulfill their aspirations for being seen as socially just, which is perverse because they're not, but also they're getting off on this and it's not okay.
We have a question from the audience. For those of us not in academia, which is probably most folks in our audience, how do civilians, that's the quote, how do civilians influence this public narrative?
Well, my first ambition tonight was actually to have us not be so shocked anymore. Because one of the most painful things for me early on was that so many well-meaning people in general, and Jews in particular, have been absolutely astounded by the silence and by the ways in which the more we talk about it, or the more we document it, or the more that we're trying to show that this really happened, it seems that the opposite is happening. The more silence, the fewer people seem to recognize that there's a problem. So I really wanted to spend time talking about the pornography angle, because I noticed that, and I think that we should all be talking about this, that when the Israelis released the film, I think that they really did think that more people would be so outraged. And that is not what's been happening. So the first thing I think for all of us, civilians and otherwise, right, it is to really shore up our energy and to have a better understanding of what we're up against. So I think that that helps. I'd like to just hear from a lot of people in, outside of the academic world as well about how to fight back. You need to know that you're all really important players, because the first thing that people want to do when they get out of college is to get a job. So you all matter. We matter too, because we're a step on the way, but I think that's important.
I'm going to take liberty here and just interject for a moment and say that this is partly what the new MA in Antisemitism Studies program is all about. It's about creating a sense of empowerment in this moment. And to do that, you have to have both knowledge and you need to learn the skills necessary to be able to combat an apparatus like those that are engaging in this, that are well-funded and well-educated, and have a lot of resources, and we need to be doing that, and that's one of the many motivations for the MA. So we need to be empowered in this moment, and I think education in this case is one of those ways, especially when it's education that can lead you to an amazing opportunity in a professional space where you can combat anti-Semitism in a formal way. Let me also call on a question here from one of our audience members. How should we refer to Jews, specifically the JVPs of the world, and of course there are many others, who spread clearly anti-Semitic concepts? Is there a term that we should be utilizing as a community to describe them?
I have to tell you, I don't know how useful that is. In dealing with the feminist impersonators, we used to, years ago, call them male identified, and then they wanted to be identified that way. So there you go. To call them Jewish impersonators, or to say, I don't know what would work. I think there are a couple of things we can do instead. And what I'm about to say sounds contradictory. On the one hand, we need to understand that they're really not that many. Okay, they're really not that many. And you can see that. Jewish Voices for Peace has very little to do with Jews and really wasn't started by many Jews. And the person who's done great work on that is Miriam Elman, no relation, though somebody I admire tremendously. So the first thing is to recognize that there aren't that many. And at the same time, to also never underestimate our opponent. Because when these sadomasochists started in the 80s, and I used to have to deal with them, and then they went in to become very, 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 very prominent women in BDS round 2, we used to say, who would believe them? And it's amazing how normalized their politics have become. So on the one hand, I think we have to be empirically precise and note that there really aren't many of them, understand who they are and where they come from. I think to some of our younger folks to be incredibly sympathetic to what it means to be a young person on a college campus. Etan Hirsch from Tufts University has just come out with a follow-up survey of students on campuses. I haven't looked that deeply into it, but I can tell you that in glancing at it, one of the things that he notes is that a third of non-Jewish students on campuses in this country don't want to befriend somebody who believes that Israel has a right to exist, or it doesn't want to support anyone who supports Israel as a Jewish state. So that means that over 80% of our Jewish students on college campuses are in environments where a third of their peers don't want to have anything to do with them. So I tell you that because I think we're going to have a lot of kind of conversos, and we're going to have a lot of people who might seem to be like they're JVP and they're not. They're really, these kids are just trying to get through the day. I completely embrace this program. I can't tell you how much I know that it will be a refuge. We have to be quite discerning because in the aftermath of those congressional investigations, we are going to have lots of fig leaf programs to essentially create cover for their institutions, and that's not what Gratz is. So it's hard to distinguish between who's who sometimes. So we have to identify, know that there aren't many of them, understand that the pressure that kids are under, and then support programs that intend to do something about it.
Thanks so much for your response, Amy. One of the questions that we have, and I'm not sure how we can answer this well, are there any sources at all that can help those that are doubting the level of sexual pervasivity that occurred on October 7th? For those that are denying this or questioning this, and this is an amalgamation of several questions that we have in the audience, what is that strategy for those that aren't denying outright, but those that have some doubts? Is this source related, or is there another approach that we can utilize to bring those individuals back, for lack of better terms?
I think that's a great question, and it's one that I'm wrestling with as well. Because, as I suggested, there seems to be an inverse correlation between putting forth the evidence and not being believed. I think one way about it would be to make analogies, other Darvo analogies, right? We know for a fact, those of us who have done a lot of research on violence against women and sexual abuse, that in the last several years, that Darvo strategy has really gone up. You can start thinking about the ways in which women are being sued by men whom they've accused of perpetrating violence. So I think kind of broadening the discussion in the same way that Gratz is broadening the discussion, so it's not all the time always about Jews, broadening the discussion to have us really understand the ways that other women who have come forward, who have ended up having a very, very hard time of it, might be one way of helping for now, and still continuing to document. We've also got the issue of Jewish funereal rituals and the ways in which there were efforts to deal with the dead as soon as possible, and that sometimes that poses problems for collecting evidence. At the same time, I'm going to tell you that there's a fantastic book that recently came out by Michelle Bowdler, an old classmate of mine from Brandeis University, and it's called Is Rape a Crime? And she's a survivor of sexual abuse, and she talks about how, I mean, the mere fact that you have to ask that question, is rape a crime, tells you where she's going in the book. And I think that, you know, those kinds of works can help as well.
Thank you, Amy. We have several questions that talk about the state of universities right now. I'll try to combine them into one because I know it's part of a longer, harder conversation, which is first and foremost, have you been or do you know of anybody that's really been successful at changing students' minds on campus? Related to that question, should we be avoiding sending our own children? Should we be avoiding going to these institutions where this seems to be a pervasive problem? And then perhaps very interesting to you and I, and we've had conversations about this. Why are these individuals continue to be hired? And is there anything that we can do to prevent them from being hired? And is that part of the solution to this?
It's an incredibly dense network. That's why one of the reasons why I wanted to end by informing us all that these are not marginal characters. Judith Butler is not a marginal character. Her proteges, her stature within Berkeley, the international prizes that she racks up. And then there are also wonderful scholars who pointed out just what a fraud she was in the 1990s. I'd encourage you to look at Martha Nussbaum's piece in the New Republic, who referred to Judith Butler as somebody who collaborates with evil. So some of us knew early on. So it's very hard. The networks are deep. There are successful programs. I know that Gratz will be successful. There's nothing that I know that's going to be like it. I will tell you that there's the Institute for the Study of Global Anti-Semitism Policy, and each year we meet at Oxford University, or most years we've met at Oxford University. We stopped during COVID, and that provides a wonderful opportunity where college and university professors come just for a couple of weeks to be able to go through the program that you've got, Professor Feinberg. And so there's that. I will tell you that it's important for kids to get off campus, to be in the larger world. And to that extent, here's a call out to Chabad everywhere. That is the one place that is consistently a refuge for the kind of unrelenting harassment kids have to go through. And what else did you ask? Where was it successful? Where can they go?
And have you been successful on campus?
I don't know. I don't know.
How do we measure success?
There you go.
Yeah, no,
And it takes people a while, you know?
Well, I want to close with one last question, and I apologize to everybody. There are many brilliant questions in the Q&A that I'll try to keep track of, and I'll send your way, and hopefully I'll have a chance to respond to if you email me. This one is from one of our guests. Is part of the reluctance of our young adults to embrace their Judaism in this time a result of, quote, meaningless or uninspiring, end quote, Jewish education that tells a story that societies in which Jews thrive, the community thrives, and communities in which Jews do not thrive, the community fails to thrive? I mean, this is kind of getting at some of the Darrell Horn hypotheses around this subject. How much is this element of our education, Jewish education, perhaps responsible for some of the trends that we're seeing?
So I love Dara Horn. I really do. I find her refreshing. And I think we need to pay very close attention to the things that she has to say about Jewish education. Now that I've given such a depressive talk, let me put another spin on it. Ironically, you're going to see more and more very young, very smart people embrace their Judaism and start to come out. I'm already starting to see this. So I do have hope. I see students who otherwise wouldn't be interested in the least in politics or in Judaism, but they're able to draw connections between the incredibly reactionary nature of this movement, how it's diminished intellectual engagement, how it fosters a cancel culture, how it pimps the experiences of gays and lesbians, how it denigrates the experiences and memory of those like Emmett Till. And there are people who are noticing, and many of them are Jews, some of them aren't, but I do think we're going to see a real resurgence. And I'm looking forward to that. And I'm already seeing that on campuses. I do see kids coming out and coming forward. And that's a great thing.
Well, Amy, we're so lucky to again offer the space for you to share your remarks and this important topic. I want to thank everyone in the audience for attending, for listening, and I hope that you all will continue to be engaged as we move forward with our Anti-Semitism Studies lecture series. I want to remind everybody that this is, yes, part of a series. I'm excited to share that on April 2nd, for those living in the greater Philadelphia area, or of course, those willing to travel, we are hosting a night to honor Gratz's commitment to combating anti-Semitism that will feature a keynote being given by Dr. Avinoam Pat, who is a world-renowned lecturer at NYU and will be presenting on responses to anti-Semitism. For those in the audience that are interested in learning more about the MA program, whether it's the MA and anti-Semitism program, those interested in the MA or our graduate certificate in Anti-Semitism Studies, please stay on. I'm very excited to introduce you to two of our incredible students, and I will introduce them shortly. Again, thank you so much, Dr. Elman, Amy, for your time. Really, really
Thank you.
appreciate it.
Thank you.